Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dion Mitchell here along with my Crime Redefined co-host, Mehul Anjaria. We hope you're enjoying our episodes as we strive to bring you interesting stories.
Well, today we are kicking off what will be a multi-part series on the case of People versus Jane Dorotik.
Our first interview is a friend of Crime Redefined and a two-time previous guest. Aleida K is an attorney and award-winning true crime writer. She also provides legal commentary and has been featured on Court TV and the Law and Crime Network. Her latest books are Murder Trials and Cases That Haunt, Will We Ever Know? And Murder Trials We Can't Forget and Other True Cases. So with that said, an introduction, Mehul, why don't you start us off with the details about Jane's case?
The body of Robert Dorotik was found in a wooded area in North San Diego County on Monday, February 14th, 2000. His wife, Jane Dorotik, had reported him missing the previous day when he had not returned from a jog. In June of 2001, Jane was convicted for the murder of her husband, Robert, and sentenced to 25 years to life.
In 2016, Jane finally was awarded post-conviction DNA testing on evidence in her case. It was at this time that she started working with the Loyola Project for the Innocent. We previously had Paula and Adam from LPI on Crime Redefined. The results of the 2016 DNA testing were deemed not helpful at the time.
While LPI continued to work feverishly on Jane's case, she was granted a temporary release from prison due to COVID in April of 2020. Meanwhile, additional post-conviction DNA testing was performed, and LPI was developing lots of new evidence. Jane's conviction was ultimately overturned in July of 2020.
Jane's ordeal was not over, however. The DA's office decided to conduct DNA testing of their own and pursue retrying Jane. After a lengthy preliminary hearing, a new trial was imminent. On the eve of the trial, the DA's office announced that they were dismissing the case.
Well, our guest, Aleida K. followed the Dorotik case very closely and was actually in the courtroom for some of the biggest legal battles. So, Dion, let's kick this thing off and let's see how the Dorotik case looked from Aleida's viewpoint.
Hi, Aleida. So great to have you back on Crime Redefined. You're like one of our perfect guests for our show.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you asking me to come on.
Yeah. Great to talk to you again. And when we last had you on, you were talking about another female defendant, Diana Lovejoy. And at that time, when we spoke to you, you mentioned you had two books coming out. I understand they're out. How did the launch go, and how's that whole thing going?
Oh, everything's good. So yes, I have two books. One is Murder Trials We Can't Forget. And the second one is Murder Trials and Cases That Haunt, Will We Ever Know? So basically what I did is I've been going to these different trials for years, and I've written a lot of stories, some published in actual, publications, and some on my website. And I took them and I put them into chapters for each book. And so I basically took 12 cases and I made each one a chapter. And so I added extra stuff. I went back and did more work on them, but to tell each story in one chapter. So yeah, it's going good. These are really compelling cases, important cases that have good lessons really for society.
That sounds like great content, and I love both titles.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So as you know, you're the kickoff to a series that we're doing on the Jane Dorotik case. And so our first question for you, Aleida, is what was the first time that the whole case and trial got on your radar?
Yes. Actually, I was doing research and going to various cases for a book that I wanted to write about deadly divorce. And so one of my good friends knew that I was working on that. And she said, hey, I just read the San Diego Union Tribune, and there's this great case that's coming up in Vista. And it's really interesting. It's the Jane Dorotik case, and you might want to go and check that out. So that is how I first heard of the case. And then I ended up going to the preliminary hearing.
So in terms of that, well, when you say preliminary hearing, for the original trial or for what would possibly be the second trial?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. So no, it was for the second trial. So
Okay.
I didn't follow the first trial, which took place in 2001. And so at that time, I was working as a lawyer. I was working in a law firm. I had long hours. I wasn't following really anything. So
you're following your own cases.
Yes, we were trying to litigate our own cases.
Right.
So anyway, I didn't follow it, but it's interesting because I was actually at this one bar event with, and the judge from the first trial, I was talking to her and she knows I write stories and she said, "Oh, how's it going?" And then I happened to say, "Well, you are, presiding over these huge trials. I mean, if you ever wrote a book, what case would it be?" And so she started describing this case to me about how intriguing this case really was to her. And so that's kind of like how I actually had heard about it, but I hadn't followed it.
Okay, so obviously since her conviction in 2001, there's been a lot of interesting twists and turns. So you sort of alluded to this already, but I wanted to get a better feel of what court proceedings you attended, and then what kind of legal documents in the case were you able to review?
Okay, so I went to the preliminary hearing. So for people that don't know what that is a hearing that's held to determine whether the court judge is going to order the defendant to stand trial. So is there sufficient evidence to basically order this person to stand trial? And so I went to that, which started April 22nd of 2021. And usually these hearings don't last super long because the DA doesn't need to bring everything under the sun. It's not a full trial. You just need to bring enough sufficient evidence to have a court bind that person over for trial. But in this case, that preliminary hearing ended up going on for almost a year. I mean, it ended on March 11th of 2022, although there was, sometimes some significant breaks in the timing. So they had a couple months where they didn't have any hearing. But so that was like really a record-breaking prelim, I must say. And I did look at various documents from the court file. And I have gone actually to the 4th District Court of Appeal downtown here in San Diego and read a lot of the file as well.
Okay, so big picture question for you. As somebody who follows a lot of these crazy cases closely, what stands out for you in the Jane Dorotik case and trial?
Well, what stands out for me is, can I just give a little bit of background of
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
So basically, I wanted to just give like the broad overview is that Jane Dorotik was convicted by a jury in 2001, so 21 years ago, of killing her husband, Robert, and she was sentenced to 25 years to life. And then she ended up serving almost 20 years in prison. But then through the years and years of effort by the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent, her conviction was overturned in July of 2020. And in fact, the district attorney even concedes to this, and you would think that would be the end of it, but it's not. And she stands trial for murder. So that right there, when you hear that, you think, wait, what? It's a conviction's overturned. You have the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent. And now, wait a minute, they're going to retry her. What is going on here? So I think that immediately catches your attention. And so, I got engrossed in it somewhat. And I think that for me, you always want to know, or anybody I think wants to know, well, if Jane is convicted of killing her husband, was there a motive? Not that the prosecution has to prove that, but that is always something I think that people want to know. Well, why would she kill her husband? And so in this case, you have, if I could just go into a little bit of the background of their relationship.
I don't want to interrupt you too much here, but just because you've covered so many of these cases, what are the big three, just for our listeners? So motivations, because it's obviously a critical, point. So what are the big three after all these trials you follow?
The big three of big three that what you want to know.
Motivations for, well, in this particular case, since we've had you on for 2 female cases, right? So what are the three main reasons that a motivation for a woman killing her husband?
Well, I think one is money. Another one is that, well, for Diana Lovejoy, she didn't want to share the child, according to the prosecution. She wants, she's in a contentious divorce. She wants this child all to herself. She doesn't want to pay her husband. So again, money. And then I think that there's a fair amount of just anger and spite, and maybe your husband has done something that you just can't live with. So in this one case, the prosecution said that basically this husband had constantly was verbally abusive to her and really just kind of quashed all her dreams that she had of this happy life. And she was angry and bitter, and it was all his fault.
Okay. So I'm sorry can you jump back into your answer?
No. So, yeah. So anyway, going back to the relationship. So, you want to know about who is Jane Dorotik? I mean, what happened here that they're saying that she killed her husband? So Jane and Robert were a successful couple. They'd been married almost 30 years, or about 30 years. They had these 3 children who were all grown. And at the time that Robert is murdered, they were living on a horse ranch that they rented in Valley Center, which is northeast of San Diego. It's actually a beautiful area. I've been to the ranch. It's very expansive. It's somewhat isolated, but really, really beautiful.
Did you say you've been to the ranch that the Dorotiks were renting?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
wow.
I've been to that house. Yes. And I've been to where Robert was actually found as well. So I've been
interesting.
So I've been to both. And so in this case, Jane was the primary breadwinner, and which is somewhat of a twist because a lot of the cases I've had, it's been the husband who has the money and the wife doesn't. So, but in this case, Jane is the primary breadwinner. She was once a nurse or has trained as a nurse, but moved into being the successful healthcare executive. She's got this big job. And in addition to this job, her and her daughter have this horse business. And her daughter, Claire, is 24 years old, and she's living on the horse ranch with them, with Robert and Jane. And Jane and Claire both just love horses. It's their passion. They just, this is what they want to do. And they want to raise and train and resell horses. And it's their dream. But the sad part is that Robert apparently does not share this dream. And he doesn't like this horse business. And there's arguing about the money that's being put into this business. And there's a conflict with Jane. There's conflict with the daughter. So, and going back to before the family moved to this horse ranch, Robert and Jane had been living in Northern California. And in December of 1997, there's problems in the marriage. And he ends up filing for divorce and asks for spousal support since Jane is the breadwinner. And so at that time, they sell the marital house. Jane moves to the horse ranch here in San Diego. Robert stays in Northern California. But then the couple reconciles 4 months later, and Robert moves to the horse ranch as well. So going to that first trial, here you have the fact that, okay, they filed for divorce. Robert filed for divorce. They had these problems, but now they've reconciled. They've recommitted to this marriage. And is everything wonderful, or is the marriage falling apart again? And according to the prosecutor in that first trial, she says everything's falling apart again, and that Jane eventually chooses murder over divorce. And the reason is literally is as old as the motive is as old as the house, right? It's money, that she doesn't want to pay him the spousal support, and that she wants to be free from him. And so, in fact, she even goes as far as to say that he's an albatross around her neck, and that he's complaining about these expenditures on the horses, and she just wants to be free. So that's supposedly the motive for why Jane Dorotik would kill her husband.
Well, and so obviously part of trying these cases is storytelling, and you're going to knit a narrative. That's a narrative the prosecution put out. But in what you reviewed of that first trial, what evidence was presented, or did you feel there was strong evidence for that claim that at this point, after they'd reconciled, that there were still enough problems that would cause this kind of motive?
Right. And see, that's the whole thing. I think that's the problem in that first trial. And what I'm seeing here in the trial that was going to start, the second trial that was going to go, is that, is there enough motive here that, okay, so they're arguing over the money. Bob's upset they're putting money into the horses. But does that rise to the level that you're going to kill your husband? Because people fight. I mean, I've been married 26 years and I've had my fair share of arguments and fights with my husband. But at the end of the day, one of us doesn't end up bludgeoned to death, right?
Right.
So it's like, does it really rise to that level? And that's the question I have. It's just that, well, I didn't see or hear anything that made it rise to that level that you're so angry that you're going to kill your husband in just a really, really brutal way.
Well, as we talked about in the Dinah Lovejoy case, having a female defendant in a murder case is relatively rare. And I think that's probably what makes these interesting. But I want to talk about the media coverage of Jane. So given the fact that she was a female defendant, what challenges do you think Jane had in receiving fair press coverage, particularly when we're talking about 20 years ago when this first happened?
Well, I think the media and just, I think society loves cases that have, interesting facts and maybe even salacious facts. Not that I see a lot of salacious facts here, but I think in this case, you had, a blockbuster issue when the defense decides to blame the daughter for the killing. So then right there, I think that really attracts people. Wait, did the wife do it? Did the daughter do it? Who did it? And then I think at that point, you just have a media, I don't want to say frenzy, but they jump in there and they want to see everything. And so, and the thing here is that Jane did do that extensive interview with 48 Hours, which is a national, television show that highlights these crime cases. So I think with that put that out there that, wow, this is a big case to follow.
Looking back, how would you rate the performance of Jane's defense team at her original trial?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because I kind of know them. But I didn't see the whole trial, so I can't say what they did inside that courtroom. What I saw was just their interview on 48 Hours. And the question I had was just like, wow, saying you wouldn't want to really say things that are against your client. An attorney, you hire an attorney that's going to fight for you and advocate for you and be like, you're going to highlight those really strong points that you have. And every case has bad points too. So you don't want to try to highlight those. And I feel like in that 48 Hours interview that they kind of highlighted some of the more weaknesses in the case, if you will.
Well, Aleida, you wrote an article that's on your website about the case, and it seemed like the focus was really about the new preliminary hearing because, as you mentioned, there was voluminous information coming out. So did I read correctly in that article, and I think you mentioned earlier, that you are considering writing a book on the case?
Yes. Well, what I'm considering doing is that it would be a chapter. So it's not going to be like one full book on just the case. It would be a chapter on this trial.
What's your take about the new preliminary hearing? And I understand it was longer than most trials. Right.
Well, you know what? It's actually surprising. I was surprised that it went so long because they originally said 3 weeks. I thought, well, that's kind of long. And then it went on and on and on. And it was just like, I was actually kind of blown away by the fact of how long and extensive it became because it almost became like a trial. And I have to say that Judge Kearney gave great latitude, I feel like, in this case to just keep bringing more witnesses and just having more evidence. And
why do you think that is? Well, why do you think that is? Or why do you think that they did that?
Why do I think he did that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this is an unusual case. You have a woman who's been convicted by a jury, and then you have the fact that the conviction is overturned. And then you have the district attorney that even concedes to having this overturned. And then you have to turn around and decide, hey, we're going to retry her. And so I think he wanted to make sure that there's abundance to make sure that it's absolutely fair and that you have this extensive media coverage. So you have the cameras in the courtroom, and that does change things.
So it sounds like he just wanted to get in as much as he could, just so, I don't know, maybe lessens the chance of an appeal or something crazy happening.
Well, I think he wanted to make sure that this was fair, because that was the whole thing with the first trial, that it wasn't a fair trial. And so he wants to make sure that the defense could bring in, could do the cross-examinations and do what they wanted to do. And also the prosecution, that it could be a fair hearing.
So after, studying this case, attending all the details of that killer preliminary hearing, what evidence sticks out to you most strongly as A, that would point towards her guilt, and B, that would point towards her innocence?
I think that the prosecution's strongest points seem to be that there's a syringe that was found with Jane's fingerprint in Robert's blood. So that when they were doing the search, the detectives were doing the search of the Dorotik master bedroom. In that bathroom, they found a brown paper bag that had 6 syringes inside that. And one of those syringes was found to have Jane Dorotik's finger in her husband's blood. So I think that sounds bad, right? So unless there's an innocent explanation. So why does she have her husband's blood on her hand? Or is it that, like the defense raised in court, well, maybe the blood was already on that syringe and she just happened to touch it. So the question becomes, well, why is there blood on that syringe? And I think that needs a good answer. Is it an innocent answer? That what she said was, well, it could have been that I helped Bob clean up a nosebleed in the bedroom, and that was the same time I threw out those syringes. Or there was another explanation that was given, that Robert would sometimes help Jane with procedures on a horse, because Jane was a nurse. She was able to give these injections and whatnot to these horses, and that he helped with that procedure. So I think that is, and that syringe was really what the prosecutor in that first trial said was the most damning piece of evidence. Although, with that, the syringe had, what came out was that syringe had a horse tranquilizer and Jane's fingerprint and Bob's blood. But what was revealed in the preliminary hearing was that there was these 6 syringes, and that one of the syringes had a horse tranquilizer and a different syringe had that fingerprint. So in that first trial, it made it sound like there was one syringe and that had horse tranquilizer in it. It had Jane Dorotik's fingerprint in her husband's blood. And it makes you think that, oh, she's there injecting her husband with this horse tranquilizer to immobilize him. So, but still you have this syringe, and I think that needs to be explained. Judge Kearney ruled for the second trial that there would be no mention of this horse tranquilizer. So I think that is a big issue. And then I think that if you believe the DNA, was there blood on the ceiling? Because in that bedroom, they say that Robert was bludgeoned in the bedroom. But and the defense says, well, a lot of these blood stains came back as negative for blood, but some of them were still positive. And was the blood because Robert had his nosebleed, or because he got nicks and cuts when he's fixing horse jumps, which is what he did, which was his business, and he would bleed sometimes from these nicks and cuts, or was there some other reason? But if you were a juror and you heard and you believed that there was actually blood in the ceiling, well, why would there be blood in the ceiling? That's not from a nosebleed. So, and then I think another thing is that the issue with, did somebody redress Bob? Was he killed in the bedroom, redressed, and then dumped out in this wooded area? So, so the detective who actually found Bob said that a matter quickly grabbed his attention, that he looked at Bob's running shoes, and it looked like they were clean, and it had been raining, and Jane had reported Robert was out jogging, that his shoes were clean and there were no splash marks on the socks or pants. And that seemed unusual to him. And then the shoelaces were also tied on the outside of the shoe, which didn't seem like that's how you would tie them. It's almost as if he testified that someone had redressed him. And then he was also wearing boxer shorts, which didn't seem like something you would jog in. So that right there, it's interesting, because I actually was talking to one of my friends about this, and that after I told her about all the evidence in the case, that's what she came back to, was this, wait a minute, this Robert is this marathon runner, this avid runner. Does he really tie his shoes on the side? That seems weird to me. Is he running in boxer shorts? Why are his shoes clean? So, and I know the defense gave some explanations that there's no splash marks because it's been raining and his body's been out there for 6 hours and the rain has washed away any of the splash marks. So of course his shoes look new. And the shoelaces were tied on the outside of the shoe because he had high arches, and it's known with people with high arches have to tie their shoe or do tie their shoes on the side. And that he also was known to run in boxer shorts. So that wasn't so unusual. Then, and then another thing that I guess it goes to the prosecution's case is that they said that Jane had told her landlord, that Bob had the flu. So Jane was renting the horse ranch, and the landlord would come by sometimes on the weekend unannounced to do work on the ranch because it was their they were going to retire there at some point. So that was their future plan. So they would come to do work on the ranch. And Jane told this landlord, Suzanne, that Bob had the flu. And so the question becomes, did he recover from this flu and then go running? But you also have the issue with the medical examiner who said when he did the autopsy that he found that Bob had died within 2 to 3 hours of eating, and that he found that he had eaten this red meat meal, which was so this red meat, a light green leafy vegetable like cabbage or lettuce, potato, beans, red pepper, or tomatoes. So did Bob have the flu in the morning, then feel better, eat this big meal, and then go for a jog? So I think those are some of the issues. And then also you had the fact that her sons had testified for the prosecution, and it was not completely clear whether they were going to testify again in the second trial, but it did sound like that was a possibility. Well, at least Alex was going to testify.
So on its face, and you gave some of the defense counterpoints, that sounds like a lot of evidence. But now give us the other side of the coin in terms of what you observed. What are some of the perhaps new evidence or other evidence or counter arguments that would actually point towards innocence? Okay.
Well, one of the big arguments is one of the reasons why the conviction was overturned in the first place is that there's this new evidence. They've done new testing, DNA testing on items that were never tested before. And they find astonishing results, really. There's foreign male DNA found on the rope that Robert strangled with, and they find it underneath his fingernails. So the scrapings from his fingernails reveal this foreign male DNA. So Jane's excluded. So to me, that's big because if someone's strangling you, it conjures up this image of him fighting for his life. Someone's pulling that, rope around your neck, and they're scratching at somebody, and you're getting that DNA under your fingernails. So I think that is a huge point for the defense that, hey, it's not Jane, it was somebody else. And then there's a lot of problems in the crime lab. You have the problems with the bloodstain pattern expert for the prosecution told the jury, and that he gave false and inaccurate information. And so the fact is that the district attorney now is trying to bring in somebody else to try to remedy that problem. Can that problem can it even be remedied? And according to the defense, all the forensic evidence is unreliable in the case because you have this gaps in the chain of custody for the blood and the DNA evidence. You don't know who's collected it. They don't have proper documentation. They don't know when it's collected, who collected it. And they're also raising possibility of evidence alteration, tampering, and even planting of evidence. So you have really in this case for the prosecution, you have these problems from the get-go. There's problems in the collection of the evidence. There's problems in that crime lab. There's problems with the bloodstain pattern expert for the prosecution. There's problems with this people that were working in that crime lab. The Connie Milton, the criminalist who has this troubling work record and has been cited for all this basically incompetence, and maybe even has gone as far as as malfeasance, so misconduct. And then you have the fact that now there's some problems with the collection of the tire track evidence that was left at the scene where Robert was found. So really, there's a lot here for the defense to work with.
Yeah, and when I was reading about that part of the trial, it was a little bit of the Keystone Cops. They were just all over the map with the securing the evidence and everything else. That was not a good look.
Right, and so that's a huge problem for the prosecution, because you have there's problems every step of the way.
What are your thoughts on the performance of LPI, Loyola Project for the Innocent, and specifically Mike Cavalluzzi in their defense of Jane?
Well, I thought they did a fabulous job. They worked obviously tirelessly, and they were very passionate. And Michael especially was very passionate in court, and he fought to, like you would want a lawyer to fight for you. If you hired somebody, you would want someone to fight like he fought. And they really went through every piece of evidence, and they brought that into the court and said, this is what they say is convicting her, and this is the problem with that. So I think that they meticulously took that apart and showed what had happened in this case.
Well, Jane's case is really a fantastic look at multiple different forensic disciplines, and probably a good illustration why some of them need help. And in some cases, how these techniques have evolved over time, such as with DNA. So looking at this, having not been involved, in the actual litigation, what are your thoughts, Aleida, on some of the strengths and weaknesses of forensic science? Not really necessarily in this case, but just in general, based on everything you learned in the case.
Well, that's a hard question, because I think it's in this case, there were so many issues that were pointed out. So in that crime lab, or let's start back at the when they were collecting that evidence.
Yeah.
So in this case, what really stood out to me is how important it is to document along the way what is being done. And that was one of the biggest problems here, I think, in the case, is that you have Charles Merritt is going into the Dorotik bedroom, and he identifies these 20 areas of what he believes are blood. And then it's this question, well, who actually collected these areas? There's 20. They don't have the documentation of actually who did it. You have the forensic evidence text saying Charles Merritt did it, but then he doesn't remember doing it. And nobody has this independent recall now, because it's been 21 years. So I think the importance of having these really having this documentation, because down the line, you're not going to remember what happened. And then when that gets to the crime lab, the same thing. They have all kinds of problems in that crime lab. They're not documenting things. They don't have, proper notes. And it's just, I think that there was a lot of problems with that. And one of the things that actually stood out to me is one of the criminalists testified that she was working there, and then when she retired, she took home the case files, which seemed kind of weird to me, because I'm like, well, this case belongs to the county, it doesn't belong to her. And she took the files home, and then lo and behold, she finds that she actually has a vial of Robert Dorotik's blood. So it's just like, wait a minute, what kind of crime lab is this that you're taking?
I'm guessing that's not standard operating procedure.
No, so that's, yes, so that was shocking to me.
And then how about the way then that this was presented in trial, specifically by the prosecution? There's, obviously, as you point out, there's maybe a disconnect as to what this evidence might say, but then really how strong it is. What was your impression of how it was presented in court by the experts?
For the trial or the prelim?
Let's go with the prelim, since I think you watched most of that.
So how the evidence was presented?
Yeah, from the prosecution forensic experts. Like, was the strength of how they presented it, was it really backed up with, the quality of the work, or the details, or even what these techniques can actually, ultimately say about the evidence?
Well, the district attorney really fought hard in the case, and basically their position was they did not share the defense's position that all of the forensic evidence in the case was forever tainted. It could never be used again. So the defense is saying there is so much problems basically from the get-go. We can't have a chain of custody. We don't know who collected this. We don't know where from where. Then it gets to the crime lab. There's swabs that haven't been logged into evidence. We have this criminalist who's had this troubling work history. These swabs mysteriously appear that weren't there before, and just all kinds of problems. But the district attorney took the position that, well, there were some problems here, but we can remedy them. And they believe with the bloodstain pattern expert that they could remedy that by, well, let's just bring in a new expert. So the first expert from trial, Charles Merritt, he made all these different mistakes and he wasn't qualified to do the work. But we'll just bring in somebody else and they'll be able to use the evidence that was collected and they can render a new opinion. So I think that was the whole issue that the defense was so upset, is that you can't even use this evidence. I give the example of, like, if you threw an egg on the floor, it's totally ruined. You can't use that. Whereas the prosecution didn't take that position. They're like, no, we can still use it. We're just going to, we're just bringing a new person. And they were very adamant about the fact that although we conceded that the conviction can be overturned, we never said that Jane was innocent. What we said is that she didn't get that fair trial, but we're going to go ahead and pursue new DNA testing and retesting of the available evidence. We're going to use the advanced DNA technology that's now available that we didn't have 20 something years ago. And we're going to see where that takes us. And in that retesting, they sent that out to Charles Allen Keel, who's this forensic scientist specializing in DNA, and he works for this independent lab. So it's not the sheriff's crime lab. And he still finds Robert's DNA on key areas. If you believe that Robert Dorotik was killed in the Dorotik master bedroom, he comes back and says that there's blood on the mattress pad, on the mattress that's been flipped over, cuttings from a comforter, wall behind the bed, storage area below the bedroom. So the district attorney was basically saying, okay, there's problems, but we can remedy this. And we're still going to go with the evidence that's collected, because what they said is that even if there was some documentation error and we don't know who collected this and that, there was 20 areas that were identified, and every area was collected from every area. And Judge Kearney even, I don't want to say agree, but he mentioned this several times about the fact that he's never seen in any case where every drop of blood is collected. So there was 20 areas identified, and there was swabs taken from all those 20. Or maybe we didn't know the exact spot, but it was taken from that area.
Aleida, do you mind if we backtrack a little bit specifically to the new preliminary hearing?
Yes.
Not many people get to attend high stakes proceedings like that. Can you break down the environment, like what it was like, who was watching, was the tension palpable, that, kind of set the stage a little bit?
Well, this was a really long hearing. So a lot of times in these big trials and big cases, you have the media that comes for the big events. That's usually the opening statements or a key motion that they're arguing, or if, once somebody is taking the stand, the defendant's taking the stand, or, some big testimony. But in this case, actually, when I first got there, at first, the proceeding had actually been, I had to watch it from home because it was COVID time and they weren't letting a lot of people into the courtroom. But when they finally let people in the courtroom, there really weren't a lot of people. And then it became where they had 2 film crews that came in that wanted to do documentaries on these cases. So with that, you have the cameras now. And so you had sometimes 3 cameras going, and then you had the different the reporters or the filmmakers there. So it wasn't, I can't say it was packed every day. It wasn't like the Kellen Winslow where, it's just packed and you can't get a seat. But I'm sure for opening statements, if the case had gone to a trial, there would have been, people would be fighting for seats.
Aleida, do you have any thoughts on how Jane Dorotik conducted herself during this whole process, either in media interviews, public statements, or what you actually observed of her in the courtroom.
Well, Jane was, very quiet, and she sat there at the table, and she had her mask on, and she just seemed like, you look at her and you would think, my goodness, she would serve you tea. She's not going to hurt anybody. So she was very respectful and just really listened to her attorneys. She wasn't like, I didn't see her being one of the defendants that's constantly writing notes and, tapping their defense attorney. What about this? What about that? So she seemed more quiet.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I get the sense that she seems like a shy person.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I had gone out this one day. Everybody got to court. Judge Kearney called in sick. Nobody knew that, he was calling in sick. So there was no court. So then I ended up going out with one of the filmmaker and Michael Cavaluzzi and Jane Dorotik to the ranch, and then to where Robert's body had been found, and also another area. So, and I talked to her, and she was very nice. We talked about horses, and we talked about, things you would just talk about to anybody on a normal day.
As we've mentioned, you've seen a lot of these cases. Talk about the importance of a strong defense team and the inequity that can result in if a defendant can simply, can't afford or otherwise have access to a great team.
Well, and that's hard, because these cases, especially this case has a lot of issues and a lot of things that need to be addressed. It takes a lot of time, and you need experts. So if you wanted to hire somebody on your own dime, this would cost you a fortune. You have to bring in all kinds of experts. You have to have people review the evidence. It would just be a really, really big undertaking. And a lot of people can't afford that. And that's why they have the public defender's office. And I know attorneys, I know some criminal defense attorneys that look at a case maybe like this and say, you know what? You should go to the public defender, because they have the resources. They're going to be able to hire the experts. They're going to be able to do the testing. They're going to be able to do the investigation that, for me to do it here, would cost you just an arm and a leg.
Well, I want to come back to the media coverage. I want to share some headlines that came out in April of 2020. And this is when Jane was actually released from custody due to COVID and her age. So bear with me when I read a few of these. So, judge orders release of elderly killer Jane Dorotik. San Diego murderess gets temporary prison release, coronavirus. Killer Jane Dorotik to be released over coronavirus fears. Murderess gets temporary prison release. So you get the idea. But what was ironic is, at this point in the process, there was already a lot of public information out there that Jane's innocence claim had gained a lot of traction. And in fact, I believe the new DNA results were made public. So if you can bear with me, I want to read something that was included in one of those articles with those incendiary titles. So it said this: Elias, who is hearing that petition, had earlier ordered a full-blown hearing on the new claims, a crucial step in post-conviction proceedings that the vast majority of defendants do not get. In his October 19th ruling, he wrote, Dorotik's lawyers have presented, quote, voluminous evidence to establish that much of the forensic DNA and blood evidence presented against her at trial was false, and that the arguments to the jury included extensive false statements regarding the forensic evidence. So my thought, Aleida, and I'm curious to get your take, is that as a media outlet, if you know that her conviction may well be overturned shortly, why would you then, in your article, use terms like murderous and killer? Why isn't it potentially wrongfully convicted Jane Dorotik? What's your thought on that, Aleida?
Well, I think, for social media, that's the murderous killer. That sounds more, enticing,
Right.
So if you want somebody to read your article, or you're trying to get a lot of views or whatever it is, it sounds more that it's a headline grabbing, it grabs your attention. Murderous killer, what? So I think that has a lot to do with it. And then, they're looking back at the fact that a jury did convict her, and not looking at the fact that, well, it's now that conviction has now been overturned. So, but I think that in our society, salacious details, they sell. That's what people want to hear. That's what people are going to maybe be drawn to.
And then kind of building on that, how about some of the TV shows like Snap that follow Jane's case and conviction? If these shows are still around, do you think they should produce new episodes about her case being dismissed, in the interest of fairness?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's what should come out is everything that happened in the case, is to show that, okay, well, this is what was said in the first trial, and this is why she's convicted. But now they brought out this new evidence and the problems that happened in that trial. And then this is what we should now focus on, because and that's, I think, the whole problem here is that you don't have that maybe the same interest as much as, oh, she's convicted for killing her husband versus, oh, well, now she's going to get out. I don't know. But, I guess I'm guessing, because I know for me, when I hear the wrongful conviction, I always want to read those stories, because you read about someone who spent 30 years in prison and they didn't commit the crime. And that should cut anybody to the quick, because 30 years, think of all that lost time and what you've had to endure in a prison.
Yeah, and even at the end of this whole legal process, when Jane's case was officially dismissed, May 16th, 2022, I saw that the media was still getting it wrong. So here's one that really annoyed me. This was on a TV news report. It flashed on the bottom on that little strip, I think it's called a chyron. It said, "Woman convicted of killing husband set free." So to start, her conviction had already been overturned. Number two, she wasn't in custody at that point, so she wasn't set free. And in fact, really, the headline was that her case was completely dismissed. So Aleida, I guess kind of the same question, but give us your thoughts on how can they get it so wrong?
Yeah, it sounds like a murder is on the loose.
Right.
Right. Well, I have to say that sometimes the reporters on the cases don't always know everything. I mean, I know when I've gone to trials, a reporter might come in and say, "Oh, I've just been sent on this case. I don't really know a lot about it." But they do know that she was convicted of murder. So that's what they write. So some of it might not be that they don't know enough about the case.
So lazy reporting?
Well, I don't know. I think some of these, they have to cover a lot of cases and they're sent there and they're like, okay, now I've got to go to the next case. So I don't know if it's lazy or they just don't have, it could be lazy, or maybe they don't have the time to do the full investigation. Or again, it could be the fact that, well, we need ratings. We need.
You're more generous than I am.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So ultimately, do you think justice was served in Jane's case?
Do I think it was served?
Yeah.
You know what? I wanted to hear more, to tell you the truth. Like I had mentioned to you before, I wanted to hear in the trial, this whole thing about the syringe, I would have liked to hear more about that, hear about the flu issue, and maybe to hear some more testimony from these experts. But, I don't know. The question, I don't know if it's been served, because you have to look at also you're left with the question of who killed Robert.
Yeah, who did it? Either it's that question still hasn't been answered.
If Jane didn't do it, then who did it?
Right.
And I think that's the whole thing. And that's the whole reason you're in that courtroom. And I have to say that listening to some of those pretrial motions with about the two boys who are now, adults, they're like whatever. And they were like, what, 24 or 27 or something at the time of the original trial. So they're grown with their own families. And the fact that they were going to maybe come back and testify again against their mother, and just the agony and that they were going through, having to go through this whole process again. And just one of the sons, the district attorney, said that, he's conflicted here and he wants to testify. He said that he wouldn't be able to sleep at night if he didn't testify, but then he's conflicted because he's got his own family now, and his son has never met his grandmother, and now all this is going to be in the media, and how is that going to affect him? And it's bringing back all this trauma. So I guess you look at I think that sometimes we focus so much on the nature, I guess, of the crime, like, oh, did Jane Dorotik kill her husband, that we don't think about, children, even though they're grown. I understand that, but they're still so traumatized by this. It's their dad and their mother, it's really a tragedy.
No, good point. I mean, there's all the legal wrangling, there's all the scientific experts, but there's obviously the emotional factor here as well. And then, I don't know, you could almost think about maybe the political factor. If you look at big picture, when Jane's conviction was overturned, she had served about 20 years of her sentence, and she was in her 70s. And you just have to wonder, if the conviction is overturned, all of this essentially dirty laundry came out about the crime lab and the strength of the investigation. You have to wonder why did the prosecutor even try to retry it? And maybe it is part, like you say, maybe it's for the family, and it's maybe those emotional reasons as well.
Well, the reason why the DA retried it, and what they said in court, was that they said, we're here for justice for Robert Dorotik, and we believe that the evidence still shows that Jane Dorotik killed her husband. So that's what they believe. And so that is why they pursued it. And, I went through some of the evidence that they were saying was showing that Jane was involved. So that's why, because they still believed that she was guilty, but that they just couldn't prove it, that the evidence now had become insufficient for the standard at which they had to use in a criminal court, which is the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that they weren't going to be able to meet that burden anymore.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about the press conference that the defense team gave after the dismissal? I believe you were there, and I know you posted it on your Facebook. What was that press conference like?
Well, the press conference was it was a time of rejoicing in one respect, because you have the Innocence Project, who, it's my understanding, they started working on this case in 2015. So, they've been on this case for a really long time, and they are fervently believing that Jane was wrongfully convicted. And now they are seeing really the results of all this really hard battle on the motions in the courtroom in all these years. And to be able to say, okay, we really believe she's been wrongfully convicted. She did not kill her husband. And now we have this dismissal, and our hard work is now being I don't want to say rewarded, but it's the hard work is paying off. And now Jane, they were so happy. They had flowers, they were giving Jane flowers. And it was really a time of great celebration. In fact, when Jane walked out of the courtroom, there was this clapping, and just it was like I don't want to say a parade, but it was like very excited and jubilation.
To start to close out here, Aleida, what lessons can be learned from this case, both with regard to the media coverage and then the criminal justice system in general?
Yes. So, well, I think with the media coverage, I think there needs to be a in-depth analysis of what has happened in the case. And there again, I think sometimes when they send a reporter who doesn't know anything and they're supposed to just do like a 2-minute thing on the air or whatever, it's hard for them. But I know like Greg Moran of the San Diego Union Tribune, he really dug into the case, did some really meaty articles and told, what actually happened. And I think that's what needs to be told, not just like the overview of she's wrongfully convicted or she didn't kill her husband or something like that, but the actual details of what happened. So in the crime lab, this is what happened with the prosecution's forensic bloodstain pattern expert. This is what happened. And I think that needs to be laid out more so that people can understand what happened.
Well, as always, Aleida, you've brought a wonderful insight to this very complex case. So we really appreciate the time that you took. And I think I speak for Dion when I say we can't wait to see what you're up to next.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Woo. Well, you can see, Mehul, that we have a lot of ground to cover in this case. This is a very complicated case with lots of twists and turns, which you had a front row seat for.
Yeah, it sure is. And I think Aleida did a great job of giving us the overview before we get into the other interview guests. So this was just really a great way to kick it off because, with Aleida, we got the benefit of getting a perspective from somebody in the media who covered it, but also somebody who's a legal analyst. And, obviously Aleida is very knowledgeable about this Dorotik case.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have to say, this is really whetted my appetite to hear more about this case.
Great. Well, we just want to thank all of you diehard listeners as well as the new listeners. Welcome. And please check out all of our episodes at crimeredefined.com or, of course, on all the major podcast outlets such as iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. And also, we look forward to seeing your comments on social media. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.